Welcome back to 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors. Shall we continue? Alright, Junpei, open it, if you please. Yeah, on it. Junpei pulled the Jupiter key out of his pocket and slid it into the keyhole. He twisted. With a nice sharp click, he felt the door unlock. Speaking of satisfying sounds, you may be excited to learn or not give a shit to learn that I'm playing today with a new stylus, one that clicks like a pen and brings the stylus point in and out of the body, which I know may not sound like much, but as someone who routinely gets inappropriately jazzed for office supplies, I'm having a great day. All right. Ready, guys? Junpei's companions nodded. He nodded back, then slowly and quietly opened the door. Inside was exactly what he expected to see from the map of the ship's interior. They were in a tremendous hall, almost like a ballroom, with a massive central staircase. Great, back to the beginning. You sure this is a good idea? What do you mean? Well, we already searched every inch of this room, didn't we? I'm asking you if there's any reason we came back here. No idea. You know, that's a good question. Junpei looked off into the distance thoughtfully. Lotus sighed and shook her head. I can't believe this. You guys followed me here, but you don't even know why. Junpei, you've got the solar system keys, don't you? He did. He pulled them out. The Saturn key card and the Earth key. Junpei didn't see what they had to do with anything, though, because he and I had forgotten where those doors were. Both he and Santa and Jury were completely lost. Fortunately, June took pity on them. Don't you remember the elevator? On C deck, where we are now, there was a big elevator behind the stairs. Remember? And next to the elevator, there was a card reader with the Saturn symbol on it. And on A deck, on the door to the left, there was a keyhole with the Earth symbol on it, I think. So the two keys that Junpei has should let us use the elevator and the door on A deck. Huh. Yes, that's right. June smiled, pleased with herself. So did Santa. All right, I got it. Let's get started then. What do you say we split into two teams? Lotus and I will search the Earth one, so you two can search Saturn, all right? Sounds good. Junpei handed the Earth key to Santa. They decided that their initial search should be brief, only 10 minutes. They'd meet back near the staircase once they were done. Junpei and June headed for the elevators. Oh, that's gonna go away. Sure enough, there was a card reader bolted to the wall next to the left elevator. He lined up the Saturn key card and swiped it through the reader. A light on the upper left corner blinked to life. Great. Looks like it's working now. All right. Now, how do I call the elevator? There was a single button to the right of the elevator door. On the button was the upside-down triangle, the universal symbol for down. There didn't appear to be an up button. Junpei pushed it. He didn't have much of a choice. It opened! Look, Junpei! June's voice was excited, but Junpei could hear a tinge of anxiety. Sweet, it opened. Let's get going. He grinned at June and stepped toward the open door. As he was about to set foot in it, He felt a hand on his arm. Wait. What? I'm not really I just... Oh gosh. Junpei was at something of a loss. What could she possibly be so frightened of? June was probably afraid of... It could only go down. She was afraid because the only elevator button pointed down. That meant, of course, the elevator couldn't go any higher than the floor they were on. As he thought about it, Junpei realized he hadn't seen elevators on the A or B decks near the central staircase, all of which meant that the elevator could only convey them to the lower decks, and the floor below the one they were on, D deck, should be completely submerged. That meant... Hey, wait a minute. This elevator came up from somewhere under us, right? Well, yes, I guess it did. It didn't open right away after you pressed the button. There was a motor noise like it was moving, and then it opened. Yeah, exactly. Yes. So, take a look inside. Junpei jerked his head toward the interior of the elevator. It's not wet at all, is it? The walls and even the floor are totally dry. Oh, you're right, they are. She looked around the elevator, slightly embarrassed. Well, let's test it. Test it? Yeah, watch this. Junpei put one foot in the elevator and bent around the corner of the door until he could see the floor buttons. There were only two, E and C. He pushed the E button and jumped out of the elevator. The door slid shut, and they heard the grinding of the motor as the elevator car moved down. This is pretty clever. A few moments later, they heard the sound of the elevator door grinding open several floors below. Junpei nodded to June and pressed the elevator button again. A few moments later, the elevator returned. The door slid open, and just as Junpei had expected, there was no water to be found. See? Junpei couldn't resist puffing at his chest just a little bit. Hang on, I have to check something stupid. Is there not? I'll check later. June, however, still looked confused. What does that mean? How can the E deck be safe if the D deck is full of water? Well, here's what I think. The elevator shaft and E deck must be watertight and separated from wherever the ship's been punctured. Here, let me show you. He pulled out his notebook and pen and sketched out a rough illustration. I see. So is that why the ship hasn't sunk? The shape of the inside keeps it all from filling with water. Yeah, I think that's what's going on. Junpei continued talking as he closed the notebook and slipped it back into his pocket. So I'm gonna go down and check it out. You stay here, alright? But... Come on, just do it, alright? He gave June's shoulder a reassuring squeeze, then hopped onto the elevator. He pushed the E button, and the door began to close. June looked worried, her eyes darting back and forth as if she was trying to make a decision, when suddenly... I'm coming with you. Huh? At the last possible moment, June dashed forward, turning sideways just in time to slip through the gap between the closing doors. Junpei jammed his finger against the open button, but it was too late. The door had shut, and he and June were in the elevator, and it was headed down to E deck. There's something extremely charming about text-only stuff like this. Like, that was still a cinematic moment, even though it's just text on screen and occasional semi-static JPEGs. Well, PNGs, they have transparent background. He was so surprised by June that he didn't even have time to think about what awaited him on E deck. The elevator stopped and the door slid open. They stepped off onto the floor outside the elevator. Nothing seemed especially unusual. No fish going about their fishy business or jellyfish floating lazily through the water. There was, however, a blowfish. Or at least something that looked very much like one. June's cheeks were puffed out, and her mouth a tiny, intense frown. Oh, knock it off. It's just like I thought. This part hasn't flooded. Come on, just look around. There's no water here. June looked around nervously, then exhaled. You're right. It's not flooded at all. See? But there's a whole lot of water. Yeah, right on top of us. What's going to happen if the ceiling breaks? Junpei thought about that for a moment. We'd probably die. Oh no, don't be so casual about something like that. At any rate, we should probably go back as soon as we can once we're done looking around down here. Lotus and Santa might already be back. Okay, good idea. Junpei glanced around the room they'd found themselves in. The first thing he noticed was a set of thick iron bars. They ran the length of the room, separating the left elevator from the right one. Well, we can't go over there. Right. Then perhaps in the corner of the room that housed the elevators, Junpei found an opening. He walked up to it and stuck his head around the corner. A long, straight hallway stretched out in front of him. Every time I see one of those letters drawn like that, it scares the shit out of me viscerally, and I can't. I hate it. Hate it. That door at the end of the hallway. There's something written on it. Yeah, let's go have a look. Junpei and June set off down the hallway at a brisk clip, somewhere between a run and a jog. Before long, they found themselves in front of the door. On it was a number, written in bright red paint. 6. I knew it. This is a numbered door. And indeed, there was a red bolted to the wall right next to the door. Of course, with only 2 people, there wasn't much they could do with it. All right, let's head back. Yes. Junpei and June turned and headed back to C deck. On their way back, Junpei noticed a map on the wall. As it turned out, it was a burnt map of the ship's interior for E deck. Huh. So you guys found door 1. They'd met back up with Santa and Lotus, who had explained what they'd found. Apparently, there was another numbered door on A deck, just like the one on E deck, beyond the door that the Earth key opened. According to Santa and Lotus, there was a 1 on the door. All told, they had discovered 2 new doors, the 6 door and the 1 door. It is interesting that E deck wasn't flooded. Lotus was quiet for a moment, lost in thought. Well, we don't really know if all of E deck is safe. We only checked the area around the elevator. Even so, it's still very interesting. You said the 6 door was there, right? Yes. Then that means Zero planned all this out. Even the sinking. That would have meant some pretty serious remodeling of the ship's interior. It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. Yeah. I wonder how long it took. Can't even imagine how much it must have cost. It would have been a ton, that's for sure. Well, that does go along with what Ace was saying. The most reasonable explanation would be that this was done by some organization with access to a whole lot of cash. Yes, it does make sense. That thought made them all go quiet for a moment. June bit her lip while Lotus sighed softly to herself, and Santa cracked a stiff neck and stared off into the distance at nothing. I don't think it's a very good idea to stay here. June looked up at Junpei with large, pleading eyes. Yeah, you're right. Ace and his team might be back already. Well, June, Junpei, and I should be able to open door 1. Huh? You guys leaving me behind? 8 plus 6 plus 5 equals 19. 1 plus 9 equals 10. 1 plus 0 equals 1. Just kidding. Alright, let's go. Lotus's words were all the impetus they needed. Back to the large hospital room they went. These door opening animations give me flashbacks to Resident Evil 2, the original one for the PlayStation, where occasionally later in the game you would have this. Every time a door would open, it would play that animation. But sometimes when the door would open, there would be a fucking zombie there. And you'd play the game for hours just thinking, oh, they just opened the doors because they're showing off that they can do 3D. And then you would shit your pants because now there's a monster right in your face. The moment they stepped inside, a tremendous voice echoed across the room. Hey! Where the hell did you guys go? It was 7. Ace was right behind him, and Clover was behind Ace, although she seemed to be hanging back. It looked as though there was something strange about them. 7 had the look of a man who'd seen a ghost. Ace was just as pale, and Clover looked as though she was only moments from passing out entirely. For a long moment, they simply stood there, looking at one another. Junpei looked around nervously, waiting for someone else to speak. No one did. He looked at 7. What happened? What the hell kind of a question is that? 7 was trying very hard to be angry, but something had shaken him hard. His shoulders were trembling and his voice was strained. Snake is... 7 couldn't finish. He just looked away, his face twisted by... Junpei wasn't sure what. Instead, Ace spoke. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and spoke. Snake is dead. He died, just as the 9th man did. It was as if all the air had suddenly been sucked out of the room. Junpei felt his heartbeat quicken, and he realized he was having trouble breathing. He could feel cold sweat beading on his forehead and neck. June, Santa, and Lotus looked the way he felt. All 3 were frozen in place, their faces white. Oh my god, that's not true, is it? We should make sure. Yeah, right, we should. They nodded to one another and headed for the number 3 door. Wait! Not that way! They stopped short and turned to look at 7. He was pointing at the door with no number. I stuck a screwdriver in there to keep the door from closing all the way. It's not locked, so you can go in that way. Where is he? The shower room, on the left side of the hallway. I put a broom in there too to keep the door open. We can get in without going through the numbered door, right? Yeah, that's right. Their new destination cleared, Junpei and his companions headed for the door with no number. Once in the hallway, it was easy to spot the metal door on the left wall. It hadn't been open when they'd been through before. But now, just as 7 had said, there was a broom stuck between the door and the frame, keeping it open. They looked at it for a moment, then stepped inside. Ugh, it smells horrible. Lotus wrinkled her nose and covered her mouth in disgust. Even Santa pinched his nose shut. Yeah, this is pretty awful. I feel like I'm gonna puke. It was just as bad as they said, perhaps worse. A hideous smell filled the air, so thick they could almost taste it. It was sour and smelled of fish, feces, and burnt meat. It worked its way through Junpei's nose and down his throat to pound against the entrance to his stomach. He put his hands over his mouth and struggled to keep what little was in his stomach where it belonged. Oof. They didn't have to wonder where the body was. There was blood everywhere. Few arms of the splatter reaching toward them as they walked in through the door. All one had to do was follow the many radial arms to their source. The body itself was hidden behind a divider. June, you should stay here. But please, just do me a favor, okay? Alright? He didn't give her a chance to say no. He put his hand on her shoulder as if to shove her into the ground like a tent pole, turned, and walked toward the end of the divider. It felt like it took an eternity for him to get there. Santa and Lotus followed, timid and nervous as a pair of children. Eventually, they reached the divider. They looked at one another and nodded, slowly. Junpei put his hands on the divider and peered around the corner. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. He felt his heart collapse in his chest like an empty cigarette carton, and time froze. He knew in that instant that he would take the image before him to the grave. What was left of the body sat in a sea of blood. Chunks of flesh torn from the body sat in the blood like tiny islands in a great red sea. A vast, ragged hole had been torn in the torso, and what remained of his intestines spilled out of it like fresh spaghetti. Smaller chunks of meat had splattered against the wall and become stuck there as they dried. Globules of yellowish fat had left trails like tiny slugs as gravity pulled them down the wall, even as they dried to it. Just like Ace said. Santa's voice was strained. Junpei suspected he was holding down some vomit of his own. Just like the ninth man. Detonator in his bracelet set off the bomb in his gut. It looked as though the explosion had been quite powerful. His legs were both bent in an odd, unnatural way, and his left arm had split open, exposing the painfully white bone of his ulna. His bracelet lay next to him. It seemed to have hit the wall hard enough to have shattered the display, which lay on the ground in pieces. Half of his head had simply collapsed. The blood coating almost made it look like raw pizza dough, covered in tomato sauce. Oh, visceral. His clothes, too, were covered in blood. The burgundy tie, the white shirt, the jacket with the yellow piping, and the gray slack. They were all familiar to Junpei. No mistake about that. It's Snake. Lotus's voice was unnaturally deep and strained, and Junpei heard it catch in her throat. The squeal of tortured metal made Junpei's teeth curl. It sounded like the noise a ghost would make. No matter how many times he heard it, he never got used to it. Every time it put him on edge. It didn't help that there was a girl nearby who looked far more like a ghost than a living human should. It was Clover. She sat on the edge of the bed, her head drooping listlessly into her chest. Her eyes were blank and stared across the room at nothing. Her breathing was slow and mechanical. Aside from the rise and fall of her chest, she didn't move. Junpei felt as if even a nudge might cause her to shatter into 1,000 pieces. Snake was probably murdered. Chances are he was killed the same way the ninth man was. Seven lowered his voice, likely in an effort to keep Clover from hearing what he had to say. There were 4 other people in the room with Junpei and Seven. Ace, Santa, June, and Lotus. Seven looked at each one of them in turn and continued. It's pretty straightforward. Not that hard to figure out how they did it. First, the killers got Snake to authenticate on the red to open door 3. Then they shoved him into it, alone, and waited 9 seconds for the door to shut. Once that door shut, it was over for Snake, but he didn't give up. Probably knew it wouldn't do him any good, but he probably ran into the shower, looking for the dead. It was a small chance, but it wasn't like he had anything to lose. Unfortunately, it didn't work. The detonator's only deactivated if everybody who authenticated when they went in uses the dead. And 81 seconds after, he was shoved in. that happened. I see. So that's what you meant by killers, huh? You need at least 3 people to open one of the numbered doors, including Snake. It wouldn't open for Snake and a single killer. Exactly. That means we're looking at multiple perps here. Junpei crossed his arms and grunted. Well, just in case, I want to make sure. Let's say you're right. When do you think Snake was killed? When we all split up to look for the parts for the Reds, I think. Right after that was when we noticed he was gone. Then that means none of us have alibis. We were all off searching the rooms we'd been assigned, looking for those parts. Yeah. That means anybody could be a killer. Wait a minute. What are you talking about? June seemed shocked. How can you say one of us is a killer so casually? Well, not just one of us. If I'm right, at least 2 of us are murderers. Why don't you calm down a bit, Seven? What are you going to gain by being so suspicious? That's what Zero wants, you know. What Zero wants? Exactly. This game was set up by Zero, wasn't it? Any game has a winner and a loser. Whoever makes it through door 9 is a winner, and those who don't are the losers. Zero is trying to make us fight against one another for that victory. Then you're saying that Zero is trying to split us up by making us fight each other? Yes. That is why we can't let ourselves fall prey to suspicion. That is why we can't let ourselves fall prey to suspicion. We have to trust one another and form a strong bond of friendship. Otherwise, we'll end up ensnared by Zero's manipulations. Then, does that mean that the person who killed Snake? Yes, almost certainly Zero himself. If there's anyone we should doubt, it should be Zero. He masterminded this game and kidnapped all of us. Doesn't it seem reasonable that he would have killed Snake as well? Junpei hadn't really considered that. If Zero had killed Snake, then Zero was on the ship with them. Was Zero still on the ship with them? There is absolutely no evidence of that. Junpei wasn't sure. Hey, I'm just wondering about one thing. And what's that? How can you be so sure that Zero's on the ship? Ace's eyebrows shot up. Really, Junpei? I confess I'm a little disappointed. Usually you're rather sharp. Isn't it obvious? Obvious. How so? This ship. Huh? Zero said this ship several times when he addressed us. I am Zero, the captain of this ship. The purpose of the game is simple. Leave this ship alive. As you have no doubt surmised, this ship has begun to sink. If he weren't here, he wouldn't say this ship, would he? He'd be saying something like, that ship, or the ship. Oh, yeah, I guess that makes sense. Ace's explanation made perfect sense. Junpei felt a little foolish that he hadn't seen it himself. Jury did not feel foolish because that's a stupid thing to say as evidence. Still, he was left with a question, and it was one of no small importance. If Zero's on the ship, where is he? Suddenly, everyone went very quiet. The silence was cold and clammy, and Junpei could feel it crawling across his back and around his throat. Again, he heard the ghosting, moaning noise, and moments later, a person who looked more ghost than human appeared. It was Clover. She looked at the floor as she spoke, and her voice was a cold monotone. I think Zero is one of us. Huh? Every human body in the room froze. The only sound was the muffled rustling of breath. Eyes darted from face to face. One of those faces was the face of their jailer. But who? Junpei said, "That's crazy." Isn't this ship going to sink in a few hours? If Zero was here with us, he'd be putting himself in danger. Why the hell would he do something like that? There's no motive. Clover looked up at Junpei and her face fell. You don't believe me. Her eyes were so pitiful. The moment Junpei's met them, he felt his heart tighten. He didn't think what he said was wrong, but perhaps the way he'd said it he'd been too insensitive. Clover had just lost her brother. His death would have been bad enough, but she'd also seen the blasted wreck of his body. Junpei barely knew him, and the sight had been enough to make him sick. What Clover had felt, he couldn't begin to imagine. In the mental state she must have been in, it was understandable that she would look at those around her with suspicion. She felt everyone was against her. The least Junpei could have done was try to understand what she was feeling. Oops. He felt ashamed of what he'd said. Perhaps, he thought, I should apologize. But before that apology could begin... Clover, I understand what you're feeling. You don't feel that you can trust any of us. Ace had beaten Junpei to the punch. As he spoke to Clover, his face was calm and friendly. But you have to understand, the more we distrust one another, the further we fall into our true foe's trap. Zero was the one who did those horrible things to your brother. Do you want to let yourself be manipulated by someone who would do such a horrible thing? Clover didn't answer. She didn't even look at Ace. The whole time, her eyes were on Junpei. He could feel Clover's eyes boring into him. They were the color of a deep winter lake. Junpei saw no suspicion in them, only sadness. Then, in that horrible silence, they heard a bell begin to ring. It was the clock at the central staircase. 3 a.m. That means we have 3 hours left. Then we need to move, now. 7, Clover, I know how you feel, but you do understand that right now it's important we trust one another, don't you? 7 and Clover remained silent. Their eyes were looking at something somewhere else, very far away. We must go. We have very little time left. Ace's words put their feet to moving. They all knew where they were going. Their next destination was Mercury. It sat, bolted to the wall near the stairs that led to the casino and the kitchen, between the 2 elevators. The Mercury card reader. Junpei stood in front of it with the Mercury key card. 7 had given him the card. I found it when we were checking out the shower room. At least, that's what he'd said. Junpei slid the card through the reader. The light on the reader turned green and made a tiny electronic noise. Now, they were ready. Junpei and June had been chosen as the investigators, the reasoning being that they had been to EDEC before and no one else had. As before, Junpei sent the elevator ahead to make sure the floor they were heading to wasn't flooded. As before, the elevator returned as dry as when it had left. Once it had been checked for water, Junpei and June stepped into the elevator. There were only 2 floor buttons they could push. The C and bottom buttons. The rest were destroyed or did nothing when pushed. Junpei hit the bottom button. The door closed. Slowly, they began to move downward. Sometime later, Junpei and June stepped off the elevator and onto the bottom deck. They stepped off and saw that the hallway to their right ended somewhere between 20 and 25 feet from them. The hallway in front of them was a dead end. But not a regular dead end. This is a numbered door. This is the 8th one we found. There were 2 numbered doors on B deck, near the central staircase. there were doors 4 and 5. There were 3 numbered doors in the large hospital room, doors 3, 7, and 8. Junpei and June had found another door on E deck, and Lotus and Santa had found a 7th on A deck. There was a 6 on the door on E deck and a 1 on the door on A deck. 4, 5, 3, 7, 8, 6, 1. And now, door 2 stood in front of Junpei. There was only one thing it meant. Do you think the next door we find? Yeah, I think so. The next one's gonna be door 9. Despite himself, Junpei felt excited. There was something about that excitement that frightened him as well. He did his best to put it from his mind and headed back to C deck with June. Alright, let's open these up. The pieces of paper they'd folded up lay on the ground next to Junpei's legs. There were 7 of them all told. They were written on paper pulled from Junpei's notebook, and each one bore a code name and a door. Why had they decided to vote that way? They'd decided it wasn't fair to simply ask everyone at once. That would allow people to force others to go through certain doors. Well, that wasn't the only reason. Junpei had proposed the voting system, and he had a plan. It wasn't a plan he wanted anyone catching wind of, however, so he did his best to act calm as he began to open and read the pieces of paper. The first one read, Ace requests door 1. Yes, I do. Would you like me to explain why? No, we don't have time for that, sorry. Let's keep going. He opened the second one. Next is Santa. He wants door 6. Yeah, that's what I wrote. Junpei continued with the 3rd, 4th, and 5th pieces of paper. Clover wants 1, Lotus wants 2, and 7 also wants 2. Huh? Wait a minute. There's no way I'm going anywhere with the Elephant Man. No. There'd be no point to the voting if we let people change their choices because of stuff like that. But just give it up, Lotus. It's not like I want to hang out with some exhibitionist grandma. I'm not an exhibitionist. I'm wearing clothes. Barely. So? Last I checked, that's not a crime. Maybe, but what about common decency? Nobody wants to have to look at a chick who looks like a half-naked raisin. I'm going to kill you. Oh my. Lotus's hair flared out like the mane of an angry lion, and she roared with a voice that shook the walls. With some difficulty, Ace managed to restrain her. Junpei, read the rest. Right. Junpei tore his eyes away and looked down at the 6th piece of paper. He opened it. June wants door 6. Yes. I don't really have a reason, I just felt like it. All of the papers save Junpei's had been read. He did some quick calculations in his head. People who requested door 1 were Ace and Clover. This was the door on A deck, near the central staircase. People who requested door 2 were 7 and Lotus. This was the door on the bottom deck, and could be reached by taking the elevator to the bottom of the ship. People who requested door 6 were Santa and June. This was the door on E deck, and could be reached by taking the elevator near the central staircase down. It took him less than a second to run the numbers. He opened the 7th piece of paper and spoke. Okay, the last one is mine. I want to go through... Where do I want to go? I want to go through door 2. My choice is door 2. Santa was unconvinced. Hey, wait a minute there. You cheating? Cheating? I'm asking if you changed your number after you heard what doors we wanted. How could I do that? I wrote it down on the paper earlier. Let me see that. Junpei shrugged and handed it to him. Santa examined it furiously. The others peered at it as well. As they did, Junpei quickly slipped the piece of paper he'd been hiding into his pocket. Although he'd never know it now, Santa had been justified in his suspicions. Junpei had switched papers. He had prepared 3 pieces of paper for doors 1, 2, and 6, and put the paper with the door 6 into the pot. He put a small mark on it so that he would know which one was his. He kept the 1 paper hidden in his left hand, and the 2 paper hidden in his right. Then he just made sure he didn't read his paper until the end. The rest was easy. If he wanted to go into door 1, he'd use his left hand, and his right hand if he wanted door 2. Of course, if he wanted door 6, that would be simple. All he needed to do was switch nothing, and say 6 had been what he wanted all along. Well, what does it say? He fought the urge to smirk. Humph, you got lucky. Santa snorted and tossed the paper aside, frustrated. All right, so we know who's going through door 2. It'll be me, Lotus, and Junpei. 7 plus 8 plus 5 is 20. 2 plus 0 is 2. The only problem's the other 2 teams. June and I want door 6. Clover and I chose door 1. That's not good. We can't open either of those doors with only 2 people. Everyone was silent. Then suddenly Clover spoke, her face blank and cold. Why don't Santa and June go into door 1 with Ace? They looked at one another. 3 plus 6 plus 1 equals 10, and 1 plus 0 equals 1. Finally, Ace spoke. Then what will you do, Clover? I'll be waiting at the stairs. You guys are coming back here, right? That's what 7 was saying, wasn't it? That had been what 7 said. Till we find that 9 door, 0 ain't gonna split us up. We might get separated for a little while, but we'll see each other again. Otherwise, we can't open door 9. That's how the nonary game works. I'm sorry, but I just want to be by myself for a while. You understand, right? There was no emotion on her face, but it was drawn and pale, and her eyes were red. No one had the heart to contradict her. The room grew very quiet. Silence drifted down over everything, like a blanket of fresh snow. It was Santa who finally spoke. All right. I'm going through door 1. That all right with you, June? June said nothing. She simply nodded. And just like that, their paths were set. It meant that Junpei would be away from June for a time, but it had been his choice, and he would have to make his peace with it. 7 had said they'd all see one another again, and Junpei believed him. Ace, Santa, and June headed toward the central staircase and the number 1 door. Clover followed them. After seeing them off, Junpei, 7, and Lotus stepped into the elevator behind them and descended to the bottom deck. And just before we go into this door, I do have to sign off for just a minute. To be continued.